Okay, we have started. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Daniela?
So, I came to Singapore 5 years ago to NTU, but actually I am Italian. I grew up in Italy. I'm from Tuscany, from a little village in the mountains, and I was a very good student, and I would say my first interest probably in science, although at the time I didn't know it. I think growing up in the countryside, you live very closely to nature. Yeah, it's very close to nature. So I always remember, running around observing things, like it's spring and would the violet blossom. I knew exactly which part, of the mountain the first violet would blossom. And then my father actually started me teaching math, or at the time arithmetics and geometry and so on. So I was always a year ahead at school from the other kids. And he was extremely demanding, and he always used to say to me, Daniela, you have to understand this, like the bird flies. And I think that's probably was the start. And then my parents emigrated to Sweden because of work. And there I had to really, I went to a country where I didn't understand the language. Is Swedish, it's totally different to Italian. I was 10 and a half, and I had to learn a new language. And I went to school, and as soon as I started school, they started teaching me English, so 2 languages. And the school was extremely good. They realized I was talented in math, so they put me with children my own age in mathematics, and but with younger children in some other subjects. And I learned Swedish. I was, within a couple of years, I could compete with the Swedish children, and I went to a very good, in my town, I lived in a small industrial town close to Stockholm. Actually, a part of Volvo, the agricultural part was called Bolinde Munktel, where my father worked as sort of low-level engineer. And my Swedish education is extremely strong. I went to very good school where for 1 year I was doing French, German, and English as foreign languages. And I gave up actually French to do more biology. Couldn't fit it into the sort of schedule. And when I went to Sweden, I also, for the first time in my life, I discovered a library, because I came from a village in the mountain, and became an avid reader. I read my way through the children's libraries, so they allowed me to go to the grown-up one early. And then after this girls' school, which was academically excellent, I graduated at the age of 19, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I won the math prize at school every year for 6 years. But actually during this time I became fascinated by art, and I really, in my heart, I wanted to be an artist. So I had a gap year, decided to have a gap year, and because of friends who were in Cambridge learning English, I ended up in Cambridge. And I suppose that was the beginning of my next stage in my career. I actually met a young man who later became my husband, and after about 9 months in Cambridge learning English and actually working at the local hospital to support myself, cleaning, I decided to go back to Sweden and do something with my life, and I ended up doing chemical engineering. And after, so I did chemical engineering, and I would say I was very good at it. I'm not sure, the subject that I liked best was still math and physical chemistry. Some of the other areas you do in engineering, like I remember hating organic chemistry. And that's actually the only subject I ever failed. But in Sweden you cannot fail. So it was really the teacher, and that comes something very important, the teachers that inspire you. And the organic chemistry lecturer was incredibly dull, so dull that I used to ask my people sitting next to me, can you hear him? Because I could see his mouth move, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. I think I was so switched off. Anyway, I relearned 1 year's organic chemistry, and I think I got 80%. So I could understand it. I just couldn't understand it from a really dull lecturer. On the other hand, there too we had, I didn't know at the time, but I was taught by one of Sweden's great physical chemists. And I loved his lecture. He was amazing, but he would also go off track and tell us the origin of words and so on. So I did chemical engineering, graduated, and 3 years later married and took the boat to England. And fortunately, my husband was still living in Cambridge. And actually, the physical chemistry lecturer who I loved got me the job. And as it happens, my husband was still studying, and we lived with our parents-in-law, my parents-in-law, his parents, who actually had a house about 300 meters from the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology, which is probably was, or maybe still is, one of the greatest institutions in the world. It now has, I think, 13 Nobel Prize winners, 10 Nobel Prizes. When I went there, Francis Crick was still there, and people like Sidney Brenner, Max Perutz. And when I actually, as a chemical engineer, I didn't know. The lab was called the MRC, the Medical Research Council Laboratory of Molecular Biology. I didn't really know what molecular biology was, because actually, at the time, which is getting almost on to 50 years ago, I started that in 1969, was actually a new word. And young people don't realize, but the lab in Cambridge is the first place in the world to have that word in the name of the institute. And I was going to be interviewed by this man called A. Klug. And I thought, before I go to my interview, and that's a lesson for young people, I decided I better find out what molecular biology is. So I borrowed a book from the library, and I found this name, A. Klug, in this textbook. But I asked my parents-in-law, my father-in-law was an architect, do you know this person? Do you know this lab? And he said, oh, I think it's quite a good place. No, I don't know. So I went to the interview, absolutely not knowing. I had never interviewed for a job before, not knowing who I was being interviewed by. And we talked, and then he asked me, what did you think was the most interesting subject when you did chemical engineering? And I said, oh, we had this amazing lecturer in physical chemist called Hegg. And basically Aaron Klug said, well, if you enjoy these lectures, I know him, he's a great physical chemist. If you enjoy these lectures, you can't be stupid. Start Monday. So within 4 weeks of arriving in Cambridge, I had a job as a research assistant, the lowest of the low research assistant. And I was put on to work on purifying tRNA to try and do the structure. And I was in a corridor where at the end I had Fred Sanger trying to figure out how to sequence inventing method for how to sequence DNA. I had Max Perutz, who had created the lab, in the lab next door, done the structure of hemoglobin. And basically, I would say it's in Cambridge that I had, I fell in love with science because I could see the beauty of research. And I would say, research at really top level research where you are, just at the real forefront of research, to me has the same beauty as art. It is art. because you are all the time have to invent new things, you know, because you don't repeat what other people have done. It's always new. And the defining moment for this, eventually, it was the most difficult project ever, and I was a research assistant, but the other was the society I was in. It wasn't just that it was an amazing place, but it was an amazing place that everybody was equal. We didn't use titles. And everybody was expected to go to group meeting. And everybody was expected to have ideas. And later on, after tRNA, I joined the Chromatin project, which was run by Francis Crick and Aaron Klug. Francis had a Nobel Prize. Aaron Klug got it soon after, in 1982. And Francis would always say, the important thing is to have ideas. It doesn't matter who has them, and they don't have to be right. We'll get rid of the bad idea. So I was in an environment where, even as a technician, you were challenged all the time to think, and also to completely you're put in a position where the project you were doing you thought was the most interesting project in the world, but also complete respect and freedom, because I was actually working for Aaron. But Aaron had never touched a test tube. So from really early on, I had to think, okay, this is a great idea. This is a question. How do I ask that question? And I worked as a research assistant for 9 years. And to my amazement, when I look back, because I was asked to give a talk on women in science, career in science, I realized I had 13 papers as a technician, including 3 single authors. Because it was, again, respect. If it was your idea, it was your paper. And it's only when I then realized I might have to leave LMB because of my husband's job. And by then I had a child, and I decided to become responsible and do a PhD. And, you know, so I would say, I worked in the same place for 40 years, and I don't think there was one day where I was not excited about, you know, I worked on the 3rd floor, pressing the button to the lift and going upstairs. So I think I have been lucky to be allowed to discover the beauty of science. And of course, it's a fantastic life, because it's up to you, really. It's up to you every day. Even as a technician, it was up to us to make the experiment work. And you meet colleagues from all over the world, who many of them are still friends. And you get to travel a lot, you know. So that's another really nice part of science.
So Daniela, so you had a very long, illustrious career in science.
Mm-hmm.
What was that initial spark that took you to science and kept you active in science for these many years? Because if I'm now trying to decide whether science is a good career, what would you think would be that spark for you that got you into this whole this career?
I think for me was by accident, really, landing in probably one of the best places in the world and being surrounded by these amazing minds. And I remember going around thinking, can I do this? Because I never thought, I had been a good student, but I didn't, you know, was I clever enough to do this stuff? And the defining moment for me, I started talking about it before, is, you know, I worked on the structure of tRNA, which was the first nucleic acid structure, crystal structure. People have proposed, you know, everybody knows about the structure of DNA, but that's really just a fiber diffraction pattern. Crystallography is precise mathematical method. And it was the most painful project in the world. For crystallography, you have to grow crystals, and I grew the most beautiful crystals. and they never diffracted. They never gave us images to be able to do the structure until actually an American postdoc, as it often happens in science, the purpose was to do something different, and she got really good crystals of a tRNA that you could buy. And eventually there was an amazing race with a group at MIT in the United States. But for me personally, the thing I remember most is, well, seeing an electron density map, which was quite amazing. And then one afternoon, we always had tea in the lab. 4 o'clock, English people always have tea. We met at tea, and the American postdoc said, I have built the first triple base pair in tRNA. So triple, normal, everybody knows of doing science, particularly a subject like crystallography, because it is probably, within molecular biology, it's the most precise method, right? It's a mathematical method. So you know when you have your structure. How you interpret it then comes, you need to understand biology. Now, of course, tRNA was very important because it's a famous molecule that reads mRNA, and this adapter molecule had been proposed, I think, by Francis Crick. And to see the anticodon, and we could see how it could read mRNA, was incredibly exciting. But also now that we work on higher order structural nucleic acid, like 4-stranded DNA, I never had any problem understanding the nucleic acid could have very complex structure, because we saw triple base pairs in tRNA. We saw Hookstein base pairing in tRNA, not just Watson-Crick. It's an alternative way of making base pairs. Yes, and then in my career then, because I have grown all the crystals for tRNA and been very, very made many derivatives, that was the other thing, staring at patterns by eye to see extra diffraction pattern, going through the whole lanthanide series, because lanthanide is so small, like magnesium. We knew that the folding was important in magnesium. I was then asked, could I consider crystallizing the nucleosome core? That the nucleosome is the building block of chromosomes, which organizes about a protein core, like a spool made out of histones, organized by 150 base pair of DNA. And I did. I got crystals more or less straight away. Someone else made the material. And it's that point that actually, I suppose it's that success that allowed me to do a PhD, that the lab recognized I should be doing a PhD. And again, I was very fortunate where I was, because it was decided I was the best paid research assistant in the building, because I'd been so successful. And they said, oh, you can do your PhD on your salary, and the lab will pay university fees. And I did my PhD in about just over 2 years. And which had to do, again, it's a very abstract problem, a very beautiful problem that arose from something that Francis Crick wrote. There was this linking number paradox. We knew that from everything we thought there would be two, how the DNA was wrapped around the nucleosome core, there would be 2 supercoils. But experimentally we could only find one. And so then the question was, what's the helical periodicity, or the twist of DNA in solution, look like? Is it like we think 10 base pairs per turn, or is it a different number? And that was my thesis, to show it was a different number. It's less twisted, 10.6, and that resolved the linking number paradox. Yeah, and then that follow on to. I was always lucky. So another thing I would say is, I said I've been lucky to work where I worked, but also this comes to maybe modern problem of how science is funded. So I really believe you need to fund science so that people have freedom. We were centrally funded. We did not need to apply for grants, which meant we didn't need to work on the projects that we had written down. I always felt I could walk into the lab any day after I had my own group and basically say, okay guys, let's not work on this, let's work on something totally different that's much more interesting. And so I had the freedom to change research area. I mean, I've always stayed in structural biology because I suppose that's the only thing I know how to do. But I've never been tied down by the method. You know, I don't care what structural method you use. And certainly what has always driven me is the interesting in biology, not structure per se, but hoping the structural information will, you know, allow you to understand how biology works.
So the world is a flat land now. So you worked at one of the unique places, LNB, and now we have exposure working in Singapore. So if you were to restart it, or someone who's starting now and deciding for a career in science, what would you suggest? Is it being in the right place or having the right click? How does it compare?
I mean, life, I think, as a scientist is harder because I think in my days we were all amateurs, really. You could be a total amateur. I mean, I was a chemical engineer, but on the other hand, I didn't feel bad because my immediate supervisor was a physicist. Down the corridor, Max Perutz was a chemist, so we were all amateurs, in a way. Now I think science research has become much more like a profession, and it's much more technologically driven than I mean, in my days it was almost entirely hypothesis driven, and often you had to invent the method, you know, for being able to answer the question. But I still think it's true. I mean, think very, very hard of what interests you. You know, if you're going to be in science, spend the time to think what you think is the most exciting things. I have had students applying to me as graduate students, and they could remember the minute they decided, the moment in a lecture they decided they wanted to work on something because they had an inspiring lecturer. So I suppose still try and aim high. Try and go to the best possible university because you're likely to have the best teachers. You know, that's, I think, is very important. I mean, the reality is most of us are limited of what we can imagine by the horizons we have. So look out to the world, think, read widely. I think reading, not many young people read nowadays, but I think read widely, have an open mind, try and go to best university, and then there also think, if I had, you know, the opportunity, who would I really like to do my PhD? You know, choose for the real reason, based on the science that excites you, that, you know, excited you in your lecture, and aim for the best. Because at the end of the day, it is true that it's much easier to do science, exciting science, in a really good place than to do exciting science in not such a good place. So I think be selective. I mean, think hard. It is okay to ask, you know. I think don't end up doing a PhD because, you know, it's close to home or wherever, you know, someone will take you. Try and at least make the right choices at each step.
So you were a mother, you had family as a woman. How easy has it been to build this fantastic career that you have made?
Actually, my husband once said to me, it never occurred to you that you're not a man. And I don't think, I don't believe I have been aggressive, you know, tried to be like a man. I definitely have been fortunate enough to be entirely driven by curiosity and interest in science, really not worrying about a career. And as a woman, I would say, when I give talking women in science, girls, be very careful of who you marry. I married very young. I was 22. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, but I happened to marry a man that was better educated than me, very open-minded. And in fact, I married young because I absolutely knew I had to get away from my parents. My parents being very open-minded. My father went abroad. He was very insistent when I was young. I was reading classical literature when I was, Russian literature when I was 12, 13, because my father wanted me to, insisted that I should read. On the other hand, their horizon was quite limited by their experiences. They had lived through the war in Italy. They had to emigrate to make a living. And I used to think I have to get away from these people, if I'm going to find myself. And I happened to marry someone who allowed me. He was the same age as me, so it's exactly the same. He was 2 days older than me. That allowed me to be whatever I needed to be. And I think it was good to be a technician for so long, because basically I didn't need to, complete my first year report as a PhD. I really was allowed to discover science and find my own way in research. And the other, as a woman, the person who made me decide to do a PhD was actually having a child. So I did it backwards. I first had a baby, and then thought, I have to take my own life. I've been drifting, doing very well, but drifting. I might be responsible for this person alone one day. I need to do something about that. So I did a PhD. I started my PhD when my son was 1 year old. But again, I would say, having a partner who is open-minded, we never had any clashes, about who does what. We just did it. And the other, for me, having a child worked really well, because I think mentally I tend to drift or be lazy, and nothing focuses your mind as much as having, or having to go and pick up a child from nursery. You go to work and you have those hours, and then you have to go. And I didn't know how to drive those days. I learned to drive to take my son to nursery. I used to cycle, and I was so focused that the minute I sat on my bicycle, I would start planning my day and the experiment. Quite often I got to my lab and I had no idea how I got there, because the minute I sat on the bicycle, that's when my working day started. And also I learned something about myself, is what made me focus, but also for me, sort of being at home weekends. Sometimes I would work, but generally I would try and be at home, because also we didn't have enough money, for instance, to have help in the house. So I would have to clean the house, and my husband did the garden, I did the house, and I would have to go shopping. I found that this is how I learned to have perspective on my science. I would write up my notes on Friday afternoon, write a list of experiments to do next week, and I also always had a page in my notebook of different color for ideas. So every Friday I would write down my ideas. And to my astonishment, I found I would go in Monday morning if I haven't been at work, and I could cross off half the experiments because I had digested my data. What I'm saying is, if you are passionate about what you do, you don't have to be at work to think about it. In fact, I had my best idea doing the ironing or the garden, or figuring out a puzzle, I couldn't figure out. I had a spell where my experiments were working in my PhD. And what really worried me, I could not understand why they worked. For all good reason, it should not work. And that worried me, for weeks. Even Aaron Klug couldn't figure out why it worked. And it's by going away from the lab. I actually went into town and fell asleep by the river, and when I woke up, I had the answer. So you have to also, I suppose what I'm saying is, that's the other thing. How do you learn how to think about science? And it's up to you, not other people cannot teach you. You can observe how other people do the science. But in the end, you have to figure out for yourself what suits you. Not two people think the same. That's been my experience. So I never tell my people, now that I have a group of young people, what to do. I might at most say, if I were you, I would do this first. But,
Yeah. So great. The last part is, as you know, the best minds and the best students are turning away from science. What would be your comments, and why should they get excited about science? What is in it for them to come back?
I mean, to do sort of science, the science that is still, it's being done here in Singapore, basic science. It's like it's in a way it's like being irresponsible. It's like having a great hobby, and this is your life. You get paid for, for being in research. If you work on something that you really want to work on, an idea that you really want to work on. And I believe, if you're passionate about what you do, and the question I suppose is, how do you get to be passionate? I think you can. You have to put yourself in that right environment. And you can try several environments. Then it's a fantastic job. I could not imagine either doing the sort of science that's entirely, all this technology nowadays, right? Like all kinds of omics and so on. But maybe it suits some people. It depends on your personality. And I think I think people should spend more time exploring and find what suits them. And from my time, as I said, soon I've been in 2019 I've been in science for 50 years. And I still think it's the best job. And even someone of my age, I retired from my job in Cambridge. We have to retire. I could have stayed, and I come to Singapore, and we have set up, I think it's been very exciting. You've been able to create new lab, recruiting lots of young people. And for me, at my time in my career, the most exciting thing is I get to spend my whole day with a bunch of young, clever people. I can't imagine other jobs, where you can do that, right? And so it keeps you young. And, I think you have to catch the bug of scientific discovery. The excitement of it. And but you are not going to find it if you do not explore. I would say to young people, if you're at high school, well, first of all, read. If you're at university, definitely go into a lab in the summer. Have a summer job. In different places, different countries, get into the lab, because actually doing science is very different from reading. Find your hero, in science. There are quite a lot of amazing people who have been or are in science. And, try and go and work with these people if you have heroes.
Perfect, yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Daniela.
Was that okay?